In the studio, joining us now, also in the studio, the Commissioner of the Mississippi Department of Public Safety, Commissioner Sean Tindell. Morning, Sean. And also from the Mississippi Statewide Human Trafficking and Mississippi Bureau of Investigation, MBI, the Mississippi Statewide Human Trafficking Coordinator.
Correct.
Get that right. Miss Ashlee Lucas. Thanks so much for joining us in the studio today. Welcome to the program. Wanted to talk a little bit about human trafficking. And I got to tell you, before we get started, the first thing that comes to my mind is seeing all the reports in the news about what's happening on our border down in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And how that, I think a lot of folks think, well, that's a long way away from me. That's Texas, Arizona, California, the border states, New Mexico. I don't have to worry about that. But somehow that makes its way throughout the country, does it not, including here in Mississippi? Does this contribute and exacerbate the problem?
Of course it does. I mean, if you look at what happens at our borders and really how a lot of immigrants are brought to America, I mean, it's a classic case of human trafficking. I mean, it takes a little bit different form than what we're trying to deal with on a daily basis here in Mississippi. But that is a form of human trafficking. And then a lot of these, particularly these young kids that are coming across unaccompanied, brought forth by drug dealers and other folks, that they are put directly into this trade, and so it is of definite concern. And then when we identify them, should they end up in Mississippi and we find them as victims, what do? They don't have parents here. It exacerbates the problem enormously. And so it's a challenge, I know, for law enforcement. It's a challenge for victims coordinators. And that's such a key component of all of this. Isn't just the law enforcement and going after the bad guys. It's what do we do with the victims when we find them?
Yeah.
So,
Ashlee, what can the average citizen do to assist in this effort? How's the Highway Patrol and the state troopers, how are they involved in this situation? And what can we do as citizens to assist and just the control of human trafficking, which is just a huge problem?
Well, one of the things is that we know we can't out-prosecute and out-arrest our way out of this.
Yeah.
We've got a huge problem here in Mississippi. And, it's very important for our community members to stay diligent. We have tips reported to us, and we act on those tips, and we're able to recover victims because of those tips. And so our community members are very important in that. And also, educating themselves, recognizing what those indicators are and what human trafficking looks like is key. Because, what happens is when you have terminology and people say modern day slavery, and I will admit, I used to put that on my slides, years ago. But when you say that, people refer back in their minds in America to the transatlantic slave trade,
right,
from abducting people from Africa, transporting them. Well, trafficking doesn't require transportation. It can include transportation, but, smuggling is against the border and trafficking is against a person. And so when you think of it in that way, don't use sensationalized pictures like handcuffs and cages and help me signs. And, you see that when people are trying to do awareness campaigns. But if someone is looking for victims that are transported from one country to another, if they are looking for people that have been kidnapped by a white van,
yeah,
or taken, if they're looking for this, then they're not going to see what we're seeing in Mississippi.
Yeah.
And if they're trafficked individuals, the victims might not identify as victims too, because they weren't held physically maybe against their will, but it was a psychological coercion, manipulation, just an overall brainwashing. And there's a lot of trauma with these children. And
I think you're right. I mean, the image that typically comes to mind is what you described.
Mm-hmm.
Is more of some sort of physical situation and physical abuse and having people literally chained and locked up and whipped and carried around, locked up or sequestered in a vehicle, something like that. But that's not always the way it works. And sometimes they're in the situation, it's sort of thinly veiled, can't get out of it, if they try to get out of it, they risk their very lives, or they're certainly
Right.
afraid to do so, so they don't speak up. I've actually heard some discussion about the possibility of legalizing prostitution in Louisiana. Because many of the prostitutes, in fact, are being human trafficked, essentially, and they believe that by doing so, they would be more likely to come forward and report it. They don't now because they're fearful if they do, then they're facing a prostitution charge. Now, I don't know if that's the way to go about this. That seems a little radical, but I think that just goes to show how serious a problem this is and how it's kind of pernicious. It appears to be just sort of innocuous, but when you dig underneath the covers, there's really serious abuse going on there.
So that was actually a Swedish model. That's where that came from,
Okay.
from Sweden. And you have a lot of national advocates, national survivor trainers that are against that legalized
Okay.
prostitution, and
Okay.
they feel like that it would. The premise behind it is we don't want these women to get arrested for prostitution.
Sure.
Right? Because
Sure.
if you can't prove force, fraud, or coercion,
Yep.
they're prostituting themselves. And so while that's good, they are definitely concerned about legalizing prostitution and having brothels and, bringing that in and it appearing that they're there under their will and so on and so forth.
Well,
So-
and I think the reality, too, and there are, I think, at least one state in this country that has legalized prostitution. It hasn't eliminated human trafficking
Okay.
in those states and in that state. And then also a lot of what we're dealing with and particularly trying to address is minors. And that's certainly not going to help that issue.
Right.
And so if anything, I think it could exacerbate the problem because what you would end up seeing is young girls that are being human trafficking and then thrown into what would be all of a sudden a legalized
Yeah, that
human
makes
trafficking.
sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
And so it would make it much worse. And I would be shocked if that legislation went anywhere
Yeah.
in Louisiana. But
It could actually almost invite the wrongdoing and the law breaking by those that are engaged in human trafficking.
well, and I'll give you an example. And this is just coming from the coast. The city of Biloxi, in a good effort, decided that they were going to make panhandlers get a permit to panhandle. My parents own several businesses down on the coast, and the panhandlers kept showing up. And they would tell them to leave, and they'd file trespassing charges on them. And they asked them, why do y'all keep coming back here? Well, somebody had figured out that they could go pay the permit fee for the panhandlers, and then they were getting a cut
Oh, gosh.
out of whatever they would panhandle. So, I mean,
Yeah.
these folks are going to figure out a way to
Oh,
make some
yeah.
money on it, and it's not going to just go away because you legalize
I
it.
agree.
I agree.
So, all right. So, how are the state troopers, Commissioner? How are they involved in this, and what are you guys doing? I guess particularly directed at this, specifically directed at this, I should say.
Well, and I can tell you it's a collaborative effort. Been very impressed, and in understanding that MBI, all the MBI agents come from the state trooper ranks. They're Mississippi Highway Patrolmen. So the communication between the law enforcement agencies is obviously very key there. But this also involves MBN, Homeland Security, really all of DPS, and so. We've coordinated, and that's one of the great things with Ashlee being the coordinator for the state. She brings all these different agencies together and trains and lets them know what they need to be looking for, particularly at gas stations and truck stops and out there on the roads when they do make a stop. Are there kids in the car? How are the kids reacting? What to be looking for? And then also educating the public, seeing something, say something. Our PAOs work with Ashlee to get out there and kind of spread those messages, have these conversations like we're having. You talked earlier about the Taken movie. I mean, people want to think that it's like a Liam Neeson movie and people are taking the girls at the airport. That's not